Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome to the show. Hope you had a great weekend. Coming up next, we're going to talk about the Women's March. That was this last weekend. We're going to talk about the black vote in America, how I think Trump is going to get a record number of black voters. And last segment, we're going to talk about talk with a student, college student, who's from Iran. And we'll talk about the different paths that his life have taken from when he was there versus now that he is here. But first, we're going to start here. We have a lot of impeachment. We're going to be inundated with impeachment all week. So I want to take a preliminary breather on that today. And I want to start off with the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Just a quick thought before I get into one of his sermons. An interesting thing's happened these last few years. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. has turned into Martin Luther King Jr. or Dr. King or even MLK. Have you noticed what's been taken out? Pop culture has taken out the Reverend from his title. And everything that people quote of his, they take out the God and the Jesus part of it as well. But the reason why his message worked is because he spoke of eternal principles, and dare I say, biblical principles. You take the Reverend part out and you're not left with much. And he would say the same. So every year on Martin Luther King Day, I pick a new one of those principles and just sort of see what's most relevant for the day. And it's election year. So I will pick perhaps the corniest principle, but also the truest of them all. MLK's messages, his sermons, all of them, entirely rooted in love. Nonstop, all the time, rooted in love. No movement will last unless it is rooted in love. Movements will get fired up. They'll become very powerful, maybe effective, even deadly, but they won't last. The Women's March, which again we'll talk about coming up in the next segment. Perfect example, right? That thing is entirely rooted in hate, and that's why no one goes anymore. But that's why the Reverend said, hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Hate multiplies hate. And he told one crowd, he said, as you press on for justice, be sure to move with dignity and discipline, using only the weapon of love. Let no man pull you so low as to hate him. Do you know people as individuals or groups in America who hate so much that they are dragged down to a level below what they hate, right? And again, the Women's March, it's one giant hate Trump rally. And it's easy to get caught up in that. But it's so easy, once you do, if you don't watch your heart, you end up sinking below the level of the thing you hate. So Martin Luther King Jr. gave one sermon in particular. Again, his speeches are great, or his speeches are good, his sermons are great. He gave one sermon in particular about loving your enemies. So just the foundation is Jesus in Matthew 5 said, he said, you've heard, love your neighbors and hate your enemy. But I tell you, right? So again, that's the world, and it's still today, the world. Love your neighbors, hate your enemy. But Jesus said, I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Easy to say, hard to do. And MLK's first point was, listen, guys, Jesus wasn't playing around. He wasn't exaggerating to make a point. He was very serious about that. Love your enemies. So how do we do that? A couple steps. First, analyze yourself. You've got to analyze yourself first. Get humble and realize that you're no saint yourself. That's the first. Because it's easy, right? You're like, oh, I hate that person. And the only way you can do that is if you think that you're so great and you think you're perfect. So if you realize you're not, that'll tone down your hatred of others. Second thing, and this is maybe the hardest, find some element of good in your enemy. Find some element of good in your enemy. Now, this is an ancient theme. Ovid, the poet, it's around 20 BC. He said, I see and approve the better things of life, but the evil things I do. Plato said that we're a chariot and we have two horses, a black and a white horse, a good and an evil horse, for simplistic terms. And they're pulling us in different directions at all times. But we each have both of those horses. Goethe, around 1800s, he said, "There is enough stuff in me to make both a gentleman and a rogue." Solzhenitsyn, Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Soviet Union, he said, "The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." And Paul said, "I see and approve the better things of life, but the evil things I do." So here's how MLK put this together. He said, "And when you come to the point that you look in the face of every man and see deep down within him what religion calls the image of God, you begin to love him in spite of. No matter what he does, you see God's image there. There is an element of goodness that he can never slough off. Discover the element of good in your enemy, and as you seek to hate him, find the center of goodness and place your attention there, and you will take a new attitude." Today, in America, we are told to hate each other. We're told to hate fellow Americans. John Tierney, remember we talked to John Tierney on Friday, the New York Times science writer. He had this term, the merchants of bad, right? So there's out there merchants of bad, giving you bad news all the time. Very similar thing here, right? There's merchants of hate, telling you that in order for you to be a good whatever member of this group, then you have to hate this other group. Those are hate mongers. And if we get nothing else from MLK today, let's put a stop to that mentality. We share stories of forgiveness on this show all the time. Whenever I hear a grand story of forgiveness, I promise you I will always share it. We shared one just a week or so ago of someone who was murdered and the parents forgave the murderer. I watched the Alex Hernandez documentary on Netflix this weekend. It's pretty good. And the mom of the guy that he killed forgave Alex Hernandez, and she said she prays for him. Even she doesn't hate him. It's so funny, like, I know there's people listening, and when I first heard this story 1,000 times, or stories like this, I'm like, yeah, that's great, but my thing is way worse. It's like, no, what's worse than a guy killing your son? If she can forgive, if she doesn't hate him, what the heck excuse do I have for hating someone who disagrees with me on tax policy or whatever? Or even like more dramatically, I'm not saying that the things we disagree on politically aren't important. Of course they are. But hating someone doesn't make a difference. It doesn't help. It doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help anything at all. And that leads to really I think this is the final reason why you should love your enemy. Practically, because of what it does to you when you hate. When you hate, it destroys you. Here's what MLK said. He said, "We usually think of what hate does for the individual hated or the groups hated. But it's even more tragic, it's even more ruinous to the individual who hates. You just begin hating somebody and you're gonna do irrational things. You can't see straight when you hate. You can't walk straight when you hate. You can't stand upright. Your vision is distorted. There's nothing more tragic than to see an individual whose heart is filled with hate. It changes how you see the world. It's so funny, we think when we hate someone that it changes them. It doesn't change them at all. They're gonna be the exact same they were, whether you hate them or not. It changes you when you hate. For the person who hates, the beautiful becomes ugly and the ugly becomes beautiful. I really think this is a foundational reason why, we talk about, perhaps the opposite is true. We talk about celebrating ugliness. I think this is why people are so backwards on so many things, is because they're so full of hatred. They can't see things. For the person who hates, the good becomes bad and the bad becomes good. For the person who hates, the true becomes false and the false becomes true. That's what hate does. You can't see right. So if you're looking at someone who has these perspectives that are way off, I bet if you do a little investigating into their heart, you can see that they're really just consumed with hatred for something or someone. And same for us as well. Forgive and stop hating for your own good. And the only way that there will ever be any redemption is to love. No one's going to change their ways because they're hated. It's not gonna, it'll never work. We touch on this in my book, How to Change Somebody's Mind. If you hate someone, if you yell at them, if you scream at them, if you cut them down, they're never going, no one ever is going to say, like if you cut someone down, you yell at them, you scream at them, never are they going to be like, you know what, he makes a good point. I will completely change my mind and agree with him. Like that'll never happen. It's never happened and never will. Love is the only way to lead to true redemption. So here's a classic story of that. Abraham Lincoln, he was a lawyer and he was working with two other lawyers on a team. It was Edwin Stanton and this guy Harding. These guys met at a courthouse in Cincinnati for the first time, and Harding described Lincoln as a tall, rawly boned, ungainly backwoodsman with coarse, ill-fitting clothing, his trousers hardly reaching his ankles. And Stanton, he like elbowed the other guy and said, "Why did you bring that GD long-armed ape along?" That was his line about Abraham Lincoln. Why did you bring that GD long-armed ape? 6 years later, Lincoln became president of the United States of America. And Stanton didn't stop. Stanton called him an imbecile, among other things. Now, Lincoln was faced with who to choose for his Secretary of War. And who did he choose? Edwin Stanton, the guy who called him a long-armed ape and an imbecile. And all of his advisors said, "Mr. President, what are you doing? Don't you know what this man said about you? Don't you, not only said, but don't you know the efforts that he's made to defeat you and to destroy you?" And Lincoln said, yeah, of course. He said, of course I know about it. Not only have I know I've heard it myself. I used to work with him. I've heard the things he said about me to me. He said, but looking over our country, I find that he's the best man for the job. When Lincoln was assassinated, it was Edwin Stanton who said maybe the most famous line ever said about Abraham Lincoln. Now he belongs to the ages. If Lincoln was still consumed with hate, if they were each consumed with hate for each other, then they would have gone to their grave hating each other. But Lincoln didn't hate him back. And Stanton was redeemed. They both were. We all were. That's why MLK said, through the power of love, Abraham Lincoln was able to redeem Stanton. Here's how he ends his sermon. He says, so this morning, as I look into your eyes and into the eyes of all my brothers in Alabama and all over America and all over the world, I say to you, I love you. I would rather die than hate you. I would rather die than hate you. If I may, I think one reason why MLK is being erased from history, and he will be, is this truth. This truth we just shared about love, the one that's so essential to his message and so essential to the gospel, of course. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit with modern progressivism. It doesn't fit with modern tribalism. It doesn't fit with modern media. We're told to hate, hate, and hate. So pick your side. Hate or love. True story. Mike Slater. We're going to talk about the Women's March, Women's Right March, coming up next. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusader. So the Women's Rights March, or the Women's March, or whatever they call it, was this last weekend. Now, I've heard different numbers, and you can never trust these numbers, right? But one number I heard was that in 2017, when this thing first started, 5 million people showed up. That's nationwide. So 5 million. Last year, 2.5 million. And this year, I saw some estimates of 750,000. That's nationwide, maybe even worldwide numbers. Usually they quote it by DC. I've seen numbers in DC where it was 2 years ago, it was 500,000 people, and this year, 10,000 people. So however you calculate the numbers, it's trending down. So why? I think one reason why, in 2017, it was all about fear, which ties into our last segment about hate, right? Hate and fear, very similar. But there's a lot of fear. Women feared for their lives. right? We were told by the media, by the fear mongers, that for profit, people telling us it's for profit, telling us all to be scared of President Trump, that he's going to do horrible, horrible things, especially to women, all women. He's going to do horrible things to all women. And he hasn't at all. Can you name one? Name something Trump has done to hurt women. Didn't he pass some maternity leave bill like that recently? Now, that actually does hurt women. We'll save that for another day. But that's a policy that the women at these marches you'd think would be in support of, right? But they'll ignore that because Orange Man bad and we hate Trump and Trump hates women or whatever. So that's specifically to women. But bigger picture, can you name, or I should say that's specific to Trump. Bigger picture, can you name anything, name one thing in America that a woman can't do? 2020 America, name one thing a woman can't do. I know the first thing someone's going, oh, the gender pay gap. We don't have time to go all into this today. There is no gender pay gap. You know all about this. When you account for different life choices made by men and women over their lifetime, then the entire gap goes away. I live here in San Diego. Single women without kids earn more than single men without kids. So if you control for those variables, women actually earn more than men. So in San Diego and many other cities, if there is a gender pay gap, it's men who are getting paid less. Now here's another factor that I think is really important. So college degrees. In 1972, women earned 42% of bachelor's degrees and 40% of master's degrees. All right, that was 1972. Just 10 years later, 1982, women started to earn a majority of bachelor's degrees. All right, so it's 10 years later. And today, women earn 57% of bachelor's degrees and 58% of master's degrees. Now, among black men and women, that difference is even starker. For every 100 black men who earn a master's degree, all right, so visualize that. For every 100 black men who earn a master's degree, 232 black women earn one. That is a massive gap in favor of women. And women also earn a majority of doctorate degrees. So in total, if you add this up since 1982, right, when women started earning more college degrees than men, women have earned a total of 13 million more college degrees than men have. So talk about like women have no opportunity, like total nonsense. Now it's just one data point. We could do this all day. But name something that women can't do or achieve in America. I'm genuinely curious. The whole thing's made up. And everyone there at these marches, they're just taking their anger of life, right? Their own pain and trauma and whining and whatever else, and just projecting it on Trump. This wasn't a pro-women rally. It wasn't a pro-anything rally. It was anti, again, with our last segment. But it certainly wasn't a pro-woman rally. Really, it's a pro-abortion rally. So I guess it is pro-something. It was a pro-abortion rally masked as an anti-Trump rally, masked as a pro-woman rally. Now, there are actual women's rights issues. Domestic violence, human trafficking is a huge one. But those all require actual effort and work and financial sacrifice. And it's risky to actually get involved in those issues because you actually have to help people face to face. And who wants to do that? It's way safer to just play pretend activist and sort of cosplay, helping people and march around and wear funny hats and feel good about yourself like you're actually accomplishing something. That's emotionally safer. And that's what a lot of people still choose to do. By the way, just a quick thing on abortion. There's so much shame in people's support for abortion that even during this march, they don't call it abortion. They don't say they're for abortion. They say they want to increase access to health care. That's still the talking point that they're going with. And you'll hear Elizabeth Warren and other Democrats do it too. We want to increase access to health care. And you're like, what do you mean, access to health care? That's what they're talking about. They're talking about abortion. Right? Did you see this woman? I'm not going to play the video, but there's this woman here. She was yelling at some camera, F everything, right? F capitalism, F Trump, F the patriarchy, F America, right? So this is David Reboy. Her name is Mona Elthawi or something, right? That's this woman with the orange hair, the red hair. So David Reboy says, in case you've forgotten, during the Arab Spring, in Egypt. This was the woman who was agitating against Mubarak and de facto supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. She hightailed it to the US when Egypt got the inevitable result. She's from Egypt. Pretty amazing. And we'll talk about this with our guest, who's from Iran. But it's pretty amazing you can come here from Egypt and then say these things about America. Right? Isn't that wild? Would you ever dream of doing that? Like, would you ever go to France and start swearing, F France, F, right? Like, I've never, F baguettes, I hate baguettes. Like, but doesn't that, it also in a weird way, it proves how great this country is, that you can be that ungrateful and you can do some stunt like that, go in front of the White House and swear at the president and all this stuff, and not be dragged off and shot in the head like the Muslim Brotherhood would do to you. But the fact that she can be so, well, again, ties into our last segment, but she's so consumed with hatred, she can't see even what's right in front of her. Now compare her attitude with this guy. His name's King Chang, who is from Vietnam, and he made this video when he went back to Vietnam.
Listen, in my country, people work between 12 to 15 hours a day in the heat to make between 15 to 50 bucks a day. And houses here in the city are going for a couple $100,000, even in the millions. And cars over here are double the price in America. And that's why you see so many scooters. There is no job in the village. And that's why everybody goes to the city. If you can't make it in America, it's because you're lazy and you spend more than what you make. And that's why you're struggling. I appreciate America so much because I know what my life would be like if I live here. And that's why I'm so grateful for America. And that's why America is great. And it is the land of opportunities only for those who seize it.
So it used to be immigrants who appreciated America more than people who grew up here and have just known like me. Like I've known no different than this my entire life. So it takes an immigrant like that guy to come in and be like, I know what life is like for a vast, vast, vast majority of people. This place is awesome. But now we're letting people come here who hate this place, hate America with a passion. Or at least they say they do, like that woman from Egypt. I'll end here just to show the ridiculousness of this whole thing. This is Allison Phipps. She is a college professor of gender studies. This is an actual tweet. She said, so my students built Lego sculptures to represent intersectionality, and they were 100% fist bump, heart, whatever. Just take a look here at the Lego sculptures. I see a pig going down a slide. I see a cow. I see Winnie the Pooh. I see, it looks like maybe Mater from Cars in the background of one of them. I see a chicken. Now, I didn't have a super academically rigorous university experience, not as rigorous as I should have, but I did major in more than Duplo blocks. This is a college professor with college students who made things out of Legos. That's a nice metaphor there for the academic rigor that is expected of young adults today, and also of everyone who participated in the Women's March. Let's be grateful for this country. We're going to talk to an immigrant next who's going to help us understand. I think we could all use that reminder. True story. Mike Slater. Spread the word. Slater Crusaders, welcome back. Really excited to talk to our next guest, Shay Katiri, master's student at Johns Hopkins University. He's in the Strategic Studies Department. Shay, how are you, brother?
Fine, how are you?
Really good to talk to you. So Shay, I read an article that you wrote in the College Fix about a week or so ago about growing up in Iran and now living here in America, and I'm super grateful you wrote it. And I just want to hear more of your story. Tell us about your parents. Tell us what your parents experienced growing up in Iran.
So it's actually interesting because my parents were Marxist-Leninists, and my father was one of the most prominent Marxist intellectuals in Iran after the revolution, and they met at the Communist Party, and they went to prison. And after they came back, they got married, and they had me, and my dad, being an intellectual, actually, he made sure that I was an independent thinker, and then he realized that he had made a big mistake because my independence led me to be a conservative. And yeah, I grew up in Iran, and for them it was obviously not easy because they went to prison and they had a lot of their freedoms restricted. And for me, it was also terrible because I was living in a society that the whole fabric of it had been torn apart. Uh, it's in totalitarian countries, when you look at be it communist Soviet Union or China or Cuba or Iran, the first thing that they do is they turn families against each other because without a functioning institution of family, society cannot survive. And this is something that even Socrates talks about in Plato's Republic. And in in such a society, it was very difficult to have a set of values that rely on classical liberalism. And at some point, I decided to leave because I was involved in green movements in 2009, and that led me to be expelled from college and altogether banned from academia.
Wow.
So
Let me stop you there because I got to let me stop.
Okay.
Let me stop there because I got a ton of questions before we keep going. So
Sure.
why were your parents arrested, and how was Marxism embraced right after the revolution? Was that a bad thing to be according to the regime, or what?
So initially, because there were three factions during the revolution, one of them were the Marxists, and initially they were allowed, but as soon as the regime came to power, they started cracking down the opposition one after the other one, and then they came after the Marxists.
Wow. Under what pretense were they arrested, and what was their time like in prison?
My mom was in prison for 5 months, and my dad for 5 years. And my dad was subjected to torture, and the pretext was just that they were not completely aligned with the regime, that they were opposition. So, for example, one of my father's alleged crimes was atheism.
Okay. Yeah. So how did that experience change them? How did being in prison change them?
My dad likes to say that it definitely made him more of a Democrat and small d Democrat. And my mom completely abandoned those ideas of totalitarianism and authoritarianism that comes with Marxism. My dad still holds those ideals without necessarily seeking them through means of authoritarianism, but the fundamental change was that they realized that pushing for some ideas through the means of the state means necessarily restricting somebody else's freedoms, and that was the greatest rejection and greatest awakening for them to reject.
Wow, really good. What was a pivot point for you and your thinking on this? And also, I guess to that, well, let me start there. Yeah, what did you read? What did you see? What was something pivotal for your life to change your thinking?
9/11 was the most well, President Bush's response to 9/11 was the most pivotal for me, and I remember when 9/11 happened, I was I think 11 at the time. No, November '89. I was 11 at the time, and I went to school, and it was just another day for me. I was too young to understand what had happened, and also it was not a disruptive point in Iranian society. So over the days, I realized that that was a big deal, and I remember that I went to school, and it was a normal day. People, students were talking about it, but not in a manner that something big had happened. And then I realized what had happened, and I saw President Bush. Do you have? Oh, I saw President Bush respond to that, and President Bush to the regime, he was a monster, and to my parents, he was also a monster because they were Marxists, and President Bush definitely was not. And I saw President Bush's response was one of not revenge but justice. One that he said that this happened because the people in the Middle East and in South Asia uh, are as much victims, if not bigger, of those regimes that did it to us. So he said that uh, we Americans are the allies of the peoples of the Middle East who are suffering from the same regime, who are the same victims. So at that point, I realized that at my very young age that uh, the world is a division between good and evil, and America was on the side of, not just on the side, but the leader of the good. And
Wow.
it was at that point that I realized that I wanted to be part of a nation that that allies itself with people who want freedom, that wants to lead movement for freedom, and believes that its interest is aligned with the interest of other people.
Amazing. So, how much, when you made that decision, and you were only 11, right? But as you got older, how much of that was an uphill cultural climb in Iran, right? Because we saw a video, I'm sure you saw a video the other day of one of the universities that have the big Israeli and American flag,
Yeah.
and the protesters were intentionally walking around it, right? So,
Yeah.
how much of an uphill climb was this for you to have that belief?
So, not hating America is not. By the way, that guy got booed so bad by the protesters, the one who's walking on the flag. Not hating America was not a big deal. Most Iranians are very open that they would like to at some point move to the United States if they had the means, and that the admiration for America is not a weird thing. The other side of it was admiration for Israel, and which I also had because partially because the regime had told me that Israel was evil, so I knew it was good. And also it was, I always saw Israel as a democracy, and I admired it, and that was a bigger deal that I had to hide. As for a cultural climb towards the United States, Iranians are culturally very Western oriented, in admiration, not necessarily in their lives, because uh, living a Western life in Iran is impossible. So I uh, but so the most difficult part was that I did try to live a Western life in Iran, and I had been raised because my father spent his from 20 to 31, he was living in Germany and Austria, and I was raised with those values, and there was a huge tension between being somebody who values things like a normal relationship with the opposite sex, that uh, knowing that my relationship with women is not completely sexual, or that sex is not a completely physical thing. From that to build it upon my normal interaction with people in all totalitarian societies, you see people interacting with each other in a purely zero-sum positive way. That you're always there. You always should have a suspicion of other people. You should always be wary of your back. And I am naturally a more trusting person. I like to see the good in people. Until they stab me in the back, I'm gonna assume that they're good people, which is completely the opposite of how you should see how you should live in Iran. So that tension was terrible. It led to deep depression for me. I attempted suicide twice and survived. And at some point, I remember my parents took me to a therapist, and the therapist said that this is. I wasn't in the room when he said this. My mom later told me that he could not guarantee that I would not attempt suicide again if I left Iran, but he said that he could guarantee that I would do it as many times as it took until I succeeded if I stayed in Iran. So that was the point that my parents were convinced to send me abroad.
Wow. We got to take a break. Shay, can you stick around for one more quick segment? Because I want to talk about your time now here in America and what's happened since. Shay Katiri, more coming up. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, I want to talk more with Shay Katiri here. Grew up in Iran, shared his story there, his parents' story of oppression, and now the redemption part, coming to America. So Shay, did America meet your expectations when you first got here as a student?
So I cannot say it exceeded my expectations because my expectations were way high, but it definitely meet them. I came here expecting a society, because before coming here, I lived in Budapest, Hungary for 2.5 years, and there I love Budapest. It's my second home, but I also realized that that was a society, that was a country made for Hungarians who were of Hungarian blood and soil, and not compatible for immigrants. They have a very, like all countries, they have a very warm sense of nationhood based on centuries of history and common culture and language and genetics, and that's all countries that are like that, except the United States.
Really? So you say you felt less, what is it, less welcomed in Budapest or less embraced, or how would you describe that?
It's both. It's just that I was there as an outsider. I felt like an outsider. I was treated as an outsider. And this is not a bashing on Hungarians, because that's every single country on earth except the United States and to some extent Canada. But I decided to come to the United States, which is supposed to be a nation of immigrants. And then I came here, and they have ever since, all Americans have treated me like another American. Nobody even cares that I still do not hold American citizenship. Not that it's not my fault. I'm working on it, but nobody cares as long as I'm living an American life. I'm as American as anybody. I like to say that it is not like I've never faced racism and xenophobia. I have 3 times, but that's the point. In my almost 6 years in the United States, it's been so rare that I can recount every single instance. So
wow, hold on, let me stop you there. That's such an interesting point, because a lot of people would say Look, Shay, you've been a victim of racism and xenophobia 3 times. That's horrible. America's a terrible country. But you say, oh, well, it's only been 3.
Yeah, and it's only 3. I mean, where how I was raised and what my parents went through and what I went through, just some jerk telling me something terrible every other year is a pretty good deal. I'll take it.
What has been, well, let me ask you this. I don't want, this is a loaded question, so I don't want to put words in your mouth. But how have you been accepted by conservatives in America, who perhaps the stereotype is to be more anti people from Iran or brown people or whatever, versus your experience of dealing with progressives on college campuses?
So I remember that I was campaigning for a Republican candidate, and we went to the campaigning took us to Sholo, Arizona, which is MAGA country. And by the way, I'm not a MAGA person myself, but we go there and we are invited with my friend who's of Mexican heritage actually, and we are invited to dinner by some of the folks who were helping with the campaign, and they were barbecuing, and we were sitting there. And these are super MAGA people. These are people who are literally showing us their bunkers that they have filled with guns and food for when Hillary Clinton becomes president. And literally, and we're talking to them, and they're like, "Oh wow, you're from Iran and you love the US. That's so amazing. We love more of you." And the problem was that they were saying that our problem is immigrants who come here and don't love this country, and I was trying to say that no, that's a propaganda that is not rooted in reality. But the problem for many of those folks who are allegedly anti-immigrants is that they have the wrong view of immigrants, and that to a great degree, the problem with a lot of right-wing media's false reportings, and also because they live in areas that don't often interact with immigrants. Otherwise, as soon as they see an immigrant who's very much in love with America, they are completely fine with it.
It's definitely true. I've been to many, not many, a few swearing-in ceremonies, citizenship ceremonies, and almost every single person there loves this country beyond belief, and I think my main point is loves this country more than many Americans do, and that's a problem.
There have been polls. I remember reading one of them recently that showed that patriotism among first-generation immigrants, which I am one, is above average of Americans, of native-born Americans, and it is very, very obvious why. I grew up in Iran. I know how great America is.
Well, that's why I want to talk to Shay. That's why I'm so grateful, because I say I love America, but I can't get it as much as you can, right? I can't understand it as much as you can, because this is all I've ever known. There's no place in my brain for I say a political opinion and get thrown in jail. So I can't fully appreciate not getting thrown in jail like you can. So other than maybe the ones that we've already alluded to, what would you say are some of the greatest aspects of this country that you think Americans take for granted the most?
Well, one is that sometimes my friends, you alluded to this, sometimes my friends say, "Why do you say that? Like, that will hurt your career, or saying this will hurt you like this or that." And I always say that, sure, but for me, if I'm not going to prison for saying it, I'm going to say it if I believe it. And one of the problems that I do think exists is a lot of self-censorship in the United States. But one of the greatest aspects of America. I think the greatest aspect of America is that one, we have a nation that is not based on blood and soil. And I always say that I study strategy. One of in our competition against China, one of our greatest advantages, is that no brilliant kid grows up and says, "When I grow up, I really want to do my best to immigrate to China." We are a nation of immigrants, and we attract the best and the brightest from across the world, and that's amazing. Um, and that's because, like no other country, we are hospitable to immigrants, and we accept immigrants as just other Americans. And
Love that.
and obviously our freedoms are amazing, but another the last point is that I had terrible grades in high school, and because of my depression, so no college took me except Arizona State. So I went to Arizona State, and I love ASU. It's a great college, but it's also not an elite school. It's a big public school. I really tried hard, and I got into the most elite international relations program in the world. And right now, my professors are who's who of former senior government officials, and literally I have one foot in the most elite circles of national security. And and I've been here for less than 6 years. I still have an accent. I don't have citizenship, but I've made it. And if I don't make it further, it's entirely my own fault, not anybody else's. And that's amazing. That is amazing that an immigrant can do that. And you know, I completely understand if many say it's not as good as it used to be, but also not as good as used to be still is very good.
Last question for you, Shay. What is something you've seen, and you can take this any way you want. This could be a cultural thing, this could be a political thing, it could be a strategic studies, national security thing, wherever you want to go. But what's something that you see around you that you're like, hey guys, watch out. Like this is not good. We're heading in the wrong direction here. This is maybe something I was fleeing from, and no one else, we don't see it, but you do. What is that?
So I have this thesis that I'm working on it to maybe make an essay out of it. That for almost entirety of the American history, we've always had an enemy. During westward expansion, first it was obviously the Brits, then it was the Native Americans, unfortunately, and then we moved to the era of expansion and went to the Spanish-American War, Mexican War. But then it became the Cold War, then terrorism, and for the first time, we don't have an enemy. So we have turned each other into enemies. And that's very dangerous that I feel I'm back in a society sometimes, if you're in politics, obviously. For those who are very invested in politics, the other Americans have become the enemy. And that's terrible because I remember I grew up in Iran, and the other Iranians were the enemy for me, but because they were my oppressors. And for a lot of Americans, the other side has become the oppressor. That if you're Republican, Democrats are trying to oppress you. If you're a Democrat, the Republicans are trying to oppress you. While that's completely and fundamentally untrue, and nobody wants to believe that the other side shares your fundamental values of freedom and classical liberalism, and that is very dangerous. That will tear our society apart. And I hope, and I'm sure I have faith in America that it will change at some point and we will return to normal, but we should be very careful not to make enemies out of each other.
Superb. And what a good message on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Shay Kateri, Masters at Johns Hopkins Strategic Studies. When you get that essay together, can you shoot that over? I want to learn more about that, and we can talk more about it again.
Absolutely. If I end up writing it, I'll let you know.
Yeah, please do. Shay, really good. Thank you, brother.
Thank you.
Have a great day. And what a great way to go full circle around to MLK and the first segment we did about not hating your enemies. Far from not hating them, but loving them. Have a great rest of your MLK day, and we'll see you back tomorrow. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word.